let's move on to our politicians panel. And all of them have been to the Poverty Assembly before in at different stages in the past. I just want to reintroduce them as if you'd forgotten who they are. So first of all, going from this end of the table, Anne Maguire MP, who is the Westminster bit of the equation for today's panel. Anne is the MP for Stirling, which she's just told me is a constituency the size of Luxembourg. I'm not sure it's quite as wealthy as Luxembourg, or there's quite as much dodgy tax evasion going on as there is in Luxembourg, but anyway. MP for Stirling, formerly, and when she spoke before, the Minister for Disabled People in the last Labour government, and now in the shadow working pensions team. So your questions on UK legislation, changes happening, changes that might be ahead in future, and a bit of what the opposition thinks about all these issues. You're quite within your rights to ask Anne about all of that. Next to Anne is Drew Smith, who is, you still a new boy, Drew? 2 years into the job, elected in 2011 to the Scottish Parliament. Drew is a Labour MSP for the Glasgow region, and is Shadow Minister for Social Justice in the Scottish Parliament. So as you can see, we've got people who are pretty well suited for today's agenda. Next to Drew, actually will be me, but it's an empty chair just now. Then is Bob Doris, MSP. Bob was elected 2007, is that right, Bob? Bob is also a list member for Glasgow, an SNP member. I first met Bob when he was Deputy Convener on the Local Government and Communities Committee in the Scottish Parliament in the previous term. Bob has a lot of interests ranging from kinship care to tackling poverty, community involvement issues and social housing. So I'm not sure whether Bob is happy or not to speak on behalf of the government, but he's certainly speaking on behalf of the governing party in Scotland. And then last but not least, no stranger to this event, Patrick Harvey, MSP, who is the co-convener of the Green Party in Scotland, Green MSP, also in Glasgow, and has had various roles in the Parliament of note, including formerly convener of the Energy, Economy and Transport Committee. Lots of interests in the links between climate change and social justice. Along with the rest of our panel, will, I'm sure, be delighted to answer the toughest questions you can come up with. So, I'm going to sit down now, if that's okay. Not that these folks need to be kept in order, but let's see how we get on. We're going to start with an opening question. I'll give each of our panel members a short chance to make an opening statement. And then we'll come for the first round of questions from you. Okay, so folks, the first question we wanted to pose is really about a year on since the last Assembly. We were talking last year about the likely impact of welfare reforms. You'll remember we also talked about the problem of persistent low pay and young people struggling to make their way into the world of work. We talked as well about food poverty and childcare, lots of different issues. So our opening question is really based upon what you see in your constituencies, what you hear about the places you represent and the work you do in Parliament. Can you tell us a bit about your priorities as they stand now, a year on from the last time we met? Let's start with Anne.
Thanks, Jim. Last year, I think, last year when I was here, we had a discussion on, as you've indicated, on the impact on welfare reform. And I think one of the pledges that I made to the conference links in very much with today's agenda, which was about working together. And I pulled together the local authority, the housing associations, some of the churches, local councillors across the party spectrum, and Job Centre Plus, DWP, to talk about what the impact was going to be, but also what each of these groups were going to be doing over the period of then the next 6 months, to, one, inform and advise their tenants or people who use their services, and how they were going to try and look at mitigation. So at this point, I think what we have certainly in the Stirling area is a wide level of cooperation between all of those groups. Having said that, I think, like most elected people up and down the country, across Scotland and indeed the UK, is the impact of what I think is the most cruel and inarticulate piece of policy that I have ever seen in my lifetime, which is the bedroom tax, or as the government are now insisting on calling it, the under occupancy subsidy, which I think is an interesting twist. Everybody knows it for what it is. So we're beginning to see some of that coming through as people are facing up to its impact, and I'm sure everybody here has a story to tell about what's happening to individuals and to families and communities. And of course the issue of food poverty is rising up the agenda. Stirling being a bit of a mixed community, but essentially a bit of middle Scotland actually. It's not a particularly poor community, although there are areas of deep poverty, but it essentially sits in the middle in terms of income and all the rest of it. But we are now seeing an increasing use of food banks. We used to only have the Salvation Army, which provided for people in real dire need at the end of the line, but we're now seeing the local churches establishing 2 or 3 food banks in the area. So, like communities across the country, we are beginning to see the impact, the cumulative impact of a series of welfare reforms. It's not just a welfare reform package we're dealing with, it is the cumulative impact of a series of welfare reforms wrapped up in the Welfare Reform Act of 2011 or 2012.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm going to go straight to Bob to make his opening statement.
Thanks, Jim. I thought it'd be helpful to see some of the themes from last year and what I've done in the period since then. Looked at childcare last year, and one of the things I've since done in relation to childcare is I've met with the Children's Minister, Aileen Campbell, to find out if there's the possibility of using European structural funds to enhance childcare provision further. I have to say that given the likely cuts in relation to European structural funds, it does seem unlikely, but those are questions I've been asking, and I'll continue to ask questions in relation to that. And that's just one of the things I've done on childcare, but I also spoke about kinship care last year as well, and one of the things I've looked to do in that is to make sure we're getting enough progress in relation to access to psychological services for kinship carers. And I've met the clinical leads at Greater Glasgow and Clyde in relation to that. The waiting list for all young people in access to psychological services was 1.5 years, believe it or not, a couple of years ago. A ridiculously high waiting time. It's down to about 26 weeks, and I think they're still trying to make progress on that. So just to give you a flavour of things I've done since the last conference I've been at, rather than just talking to the last conference and forgetting about those issues. Those are a couple of the things that I've done. In terms of what's formed a lot of my workload over the last year, I have to say I've not been personally, but a number of members of my staff have been representing constituents in terms of appeals in relation to benefit losses, be it DLA or work capability assessment judgments, that kind of thing, because of the moral support. Sometimes my constituents need to have someone from my office there to support them, and there's been varying degrees of success, I have to say, in relation to those appeals, but the whole process has been an absolute car crash for the most vulnerable people in society, and it continues to be so. And we often talk at a Scottish level about trying to mitigate the worst effects of UK welfare reform. Well, on a very localised level in my office, the least we can do is, where possible, where time allows, is go and support individual constituents when they ask for that, and that's something we've done on an individual basis. Now, if welfare reform in relation to disability was a car crash. The car crash waiting to happen imminently any day now is, of course, the bedroom tax, and that's that now forms a lot of my workload in terms of talking to social housing providers in relation to how I think it's 105,000 households across Scotland that are going to be affected by the bedroom tax. We'll maybe have a more detailed chat about that later if the questions come up, but I have to say on a constituency basis it's trying to work constructively with local social housing providers, and I'm not delighted about much in relation to the bedroom tax because it should be killed stone dead. Others say it can be reformed. The SNP is very clear it should be killed stone dead. Housing benefits should be taken out of the universal credit element, and the bedroom tax should be killed stone dead. There is no way you can properly mitigate the bedroom tax. It must just go. It's as simple as that. But on a Glasgow basis, I'm working with individual housing associations, and I don't get any appetite from housing associations to evict anyone in relation to the bedroom tax. What I get is working with vulnerable constituents to see what we can do on this matter. So those are the two things that on a day-to-day basis come across my office: the previous welfare reforms in terms of disability and the like, and currently the bedroom tax.
Thank you very much. Okay, some common ground already, but let's move to Patrick. And Patrick, ask for your perspective on all the priorities you see coming through your work.
Well, some of the specific issues that I've been working on at present and in the last year or so are in issues like public transport and housing have been particular focus for me. The very many people in Glasgow particularly who rely on, depend on bus services and are seeing those bus services get ever more expensive, ever less reliable, and often cut right away from their communities, particularly in the evenings. You know, a city with a huge proportion of people who don't have access to a car ought to be putting a priority in a world-class public transport service. And we've got a really rubbish public transport system in Glasgow, I think, compared to a lot of other cities. And I think there's an environmental as well as a social justice argument for that. I'm going to be doing some more work on housing, particularly in relation to the private rented sector, and I think the government, the Scottish Government, is willing to do some work on this, but it probably needs to be pushed to go a bit further, to go a bit beyond its comfort zone in relation to the private rented housing sector, and I'll be doing some work on that. But over and above that, some of the arguments that I think we need to win, some of the big overreaching arguments that I think we need to win in Scotland at the moment, and I think we've got an opportunity to put these big ideas onto the table as we go forward towards the referendum on independence. Both sides of that debate have an opportunity to address some of the big questions. The idea that we can protect public services and still offer people tax cut after tax cut, including some of the wealthiest people and companies offering them tax cut after tax cut, simply doesn't add up. And we need to win the argument. If we want Scandinavian-style public services, we need to win the argument for Scandinavian-style taxes on the wealthy. And on welfare, you know, we've seen year after year after year of divisive language, whether it's the current language of strivers and skivers, or whether it was all of the language about hard-working families. This kind of language is designed to undermine the empathy and the compassion that people feel for one another. And if we don't rekindle that empathy, compassion, even call it solidarity if you want, that people feel for one another, we will not win again the argument for a welfare state. And that's what this generation's got to do, is win the argument for a welfare state, almost from first principles, because it's being dismantled in front of our eyes. I don't believe the UK government would be finding it possible to do that if they hadn't already undermined that sense of compassion and empathy, which you need to have in a society if you're going to win the argument for a welfare state. And so if we can use the next couple of years when Scotland's debating its whole future to put these big ideas back onto the table, then I think we'll have got a chance of changing the political landscape, whether we get a yes or a no result from that referendum.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Drew now to offer his view of priorities a year on?
Thanks, Jim. Last year, I remember I took part in the workshop around fuel poverty. So in terms of one of the great things about this conference, when you're invited to come on the platform to do it, is they first of all say, do you want to be involved in our planning group for the conference? And then once you've left the conference, you get loads of emails and phone calls saying, you said you would do, when are we going to find out what you did? So what I took away was a commitment to go and speak to housing associations here in the city. I represent Glasgow. So here in Glasgow around what they were doing around fuel poverty. So which local associations, because we've got big associations in Glasgow like GHA, but we've also got lots of small community-based social landlords. And did they have strategies in place around fuel poverty, and what sort of things were in them? And did they reflect some of the concerns that people were raising here? So we did manage, I hope, to pull that all together into one place for the Poverty Alliance to look at, but it also sparked off conversations with a number of those organisations who said, well, yeah, we do have a strategy, but I think we did it in about 2004. I'll ask somebody to look it out for you. And, you know, they came in and a lot of them were very good. But a lot of questions came back saying, well, what sort of thing were people asking about? What were their issues? Maybe we could look again at this. And it also sparked some conversations around this whole wider welfare reform agenda, which did dominate a lot of our discussion last year, and I'm sure it will again this year. And that was to go and because I suppose the sense that I had at that time, a lot of this was starting to take effect, but obviously we're only now seeing the bedroom tax, as Anne and others have mentioned, about to come in April, was that people in the field, so professionals in housing organisations, were extremely concerned about the impact that it would have on them as landlords and how they would deal with that impact. But in terms of people in communities, there was an element of fear about what some of the welfare reform changes would mean, and we're now starting to see that fear turning into anger. And what I try to do in the conversations that I've been having with organisations in Glasgow that I represent and work with is to say, don't just think about it in your own terms. So I've been to housing associations and said, look, that's great that you're thinking about the impact that all the bedroom tax or whatever the change you're most concerned about will have on your organisation. But what are you doing to support other people in your community? Where are the links that you have made? Have you been and spoken to, for example, did you realise that actually a move to claiming your benefits online and having a penalty if you get that benefit claim wrong, how terrifying that is for people completing the form, and also how difficult it will be for those people completing the form. So don't just put in place a system to worry about how you're going to deal with your tenants and their claims. Where is the capacity being built in the community? Are you actually involved in a group with other organisations like the local churches, like other community groups, where you can actually train volunteers and train people involved in the system to say, right, let's actually think about this on a much wider basis, because the community capacity that we're going to need to respond to this in a campaigning sense and to convince the government that they're wrong is going to need all of us working together. And also we're going to need the practical steps, and we're going to share that learning between us, because otherwise we will simply shuffle resources around between the organisations most in need. And one of the most depressing things that I initially heard was people saying, but we've asked the CAB to give us their volunteer, and the CAB are going to send their volunteer down, that they're going to do that for us. And I said, and what about when the CAB says we need that volunteer back because we've just had a call for something else that's more urgent? Have you built the capacity? Have you trained people to be able to pick that up? So I think that has been the key thing for me over the last year, Jim.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, a big theme that runs through all of these events is the importance of effective engagement. And what's different about this from many other events is partly what Drew said about we expect people to come back and tell us what they've done, having made commitments. Is that feedback element. But it's also a chance to engage with people who experience poverty in the here and now, and to work with people who do, and to advocate for people who do. So this is your chance to pose your questions, make your statements. All we'd ask is you keep them brief, please. We'll have a first round of your input and then some responses, and we'll move on to another question after this. So let's start over here. There's some roving mics. If you wouldn't mind telling us your name, please, before your question.
Hi,
Thank
my
you.
name's Frank Toner. The panel talked a lot about social engagement. How does the panel feel about mounting a cross-party attack on the welfare reforms? And if they don't they feel that they're letting down their own constituents and voters?
Thank you very much. In the middle of the room here. Come to the lady who's wearing the red top, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Just, we'll come to you in a second there. There's a woman just behind you.
Right,
Thank
there
you.
I am before you. Aye, you can get right in after me. My name's Anne Lynch, I'm an anti-poverty campaigner. I would actually like to ask a lot of questions about the Welfare Reform Bill, which is now the Welfare Act, but I'm not going to. I'll save that till later. What I wanted to specifically ask a question on, especially to Drew Smith, because you've spoken on an issue that's very close to my own heart. You spoke about fuel poverty, and you spoke about a strategy for fuel poverty. So what I would like to say, or I'd like to ask, maybe all the panel members, I think first of all, it was in the papers today that apparently we're experiencing the coldest March in 50 years, and it's been awful cold. It's been pretty Baltic, to be honest. And one of the good things about that is we've had 7 days in a row where it's been Baltic. And if you're on the brew, we're going to get £25 in our gyro next week. Although that was reduced for 25 and it used to be 27. Do you know that 27,000 people have died in the UK in the last 10 years because they can't afford to heat their house? 27,000 people. And that report was done by a guy called Professor John Hills. He was commissioned by the government, the Westminster government. He worked for the London School of Economics and he looks at poverty. And actually when he produced that figure, The Independent did an article and said it was an underestimation. It was probably a lot higher than that. I think that is disgrace. In an oil-rich country like Scotland, we've got an abundance of natural resources, oil, gas, renewables, water, fish, to name but a few. Unfortunately, we can't afford the fish. But it's disgraceful that 27 people have died because they can't afford to heat their house. So back to my question. My question is, I'm involved in a campaign called the Campaign 250. We set up that campaign 3.5 years ago in Dalmuir and Clydebank. We've had loads of public meetings, and it was in response to the terrible cold winter of October 2009 going up to April 2010, the 6 months long horrible cold winter. And what we were asking for, it's very simple. We've been asking for very, very simple. In fact, it's not very radical. We're just asking the government if the government would extend the national winter fuel payment currently paid to our over 60s community. Well, it was £250, they've cut it to £200, but we're sticking to £250. Would the government please extend that to everybody under 60 that's a single parent, that's a low pay, that is a student, that's on the dole? Anybody that suffers disadvantage should at least get that £250 at the end of November. It would definitely stop a few thousand fuel poverty deaths in the winter. It's not much to ask. We're not asking for public ownership yet. £250 is okay. Can I just say, be finishing, the campaign is getting big. The Glasgow University Students' Association have affiliated, Strathclyde Uni have affiliated, the National Campaign Against Poverty Among Students is affiliated. I know that Unite the Union and PCS are looking very sympathetically just now to this very unradical demand of £250. They're looking at it and there might be a result at their spring conferences. Just the last thing, Western Bartonshire Council have affiliated to the campaign. They took a unanimous decision that it was fair and democratic, and it's not a lot to ask for that the citizens of this country are getting that £250, and that's a massive local authority, and it's Labour, SNP, Independents and all the rest. They agreed that they should affiliate to the Campaign 250. So first of all, I want to ask Drew, because he made a really good contribution about a strategy about fuel poverty. Would you agree with us, Drew? £250, no a lot of money.
Thank you, Anne. Don't answer it. Don't answer it yet, Drew. We're going to move across the Clyde from Western Bartonshire to Inverclyde, if I'm not mistaken, to Nell, who has a question as well. Thank you.
After hearing that, I don't know how many questions I've got now. I was in at the poverty and mental health group this morning, and I was absolutely shocked, and I am raging at the welfare, not against the welfare reforms, but the way they've been carried out. And when I heard what they're doing to mental health, people who are going to get assessed, it's an absolute disgrace. I'm so angry I could punch somebody in the nose if I could get somebody here that I could get. But having said that, I would like to know what the people on you nice people who are very caring, obviously, are going to do about. Are you going to shoot your neck out and go against this the way they're doing it? I'm not against reforms, far from it. I'm against the way they're going about it. It's absolutely cruel. It's a disgrace. And what are all the parties going to do about it? And while I'm just for 1 minute, Jim, I won't say, the lady at the back's talking about extending the £250 to other people. Does the lady at the back know that the government are talking about taking it off the pensioners altogether next winter? No, you didn't know that, did you? No, you didn't. That's my... I'm not
Thank you, Neil. No, okay. If you're really, really brief, we can take 3 more in this session and we'll come back for more afterwards. So one hand up over here, and then Danny here and Susan here, okay? We'll come back. I'll come back in the next session for you, Bill.
Thanks.
Thank you,
John Wood. What are your thoughts on stigma and challenging public attitudes?
Couldn't quite hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
A bit better.
Right, okay, I don't want you to miss this one, all right?
Right.
What are your thoughts on stigma and challenging public attitudes? And please, a human answer, not a political one.
Okay, just in case you couldn't hear, John's question was about stigma and public attitudes towards people who experience prejudice, especially people who are in poverty. Thank you. Where were we? Danny, thank you.
Is it on, yeah?
It is.
It's just following on from last year, because you did allude to what's happened since last year. Last year there was discussion about food banks, and there was split opinion. Some people said we should develop them. People like me said we should absolutely escalate them in order to embarrass the government by making poverty visual. Well, the food banks are growing and the government are not in the slightest bit embarrassed. What in actual fact they've done is turned it on its head. They have now regarded food banks as the workhouses without walls. They're actually using food banks as a fear mechanism. Nobody wants to end up having to go to a food bank. So instead of putting people in workhouses, we actually now have them embarrassed so that they don't go to the food banks. In Western Bartonshire, we have decided not to go down that road since the government can't be embarrassed. We're not setting up a food bank. We're setting up a food share. And our food share's got 3 objectives. One is the fact we will feed people because people need fed. But our second objective is we will lobby for change to make sure that food banks are not seen as a long-term part of the welfare state. And thirdly, we will try and encourage all the food banks to change from being food banks into food share, and to, instead of actually just feeding people, turn them into an army of people who are angry against the government to eradicate food banks. So if anybody wants to talk to us about the food share, pick us up later on in the conference.
Thanks, Danny. Okay, last one just for this round. Susan, thank you.
Mine has to be that things are just so bad out there, eh? Folk are starving. Folk are talking about having to gear up their bairns when the housing benefit comes in. The bedroom tax is just a disaster. It's no longer about folk contact. Many are saying, I can't cope. They're really seriously talking about they think it's beneficial for them to hand their bairns there because at least they're going to be fed. And I'm absolutely raging with every party, not just 1 or 2 parties, with every party, because in Scotland it's not good enough for Labour to sit and say, we're going on pause. We need opposition in every government. We seriously need it. And I put my hand up and say that I was absolutely disgusted last week that Labour voted for to abstain, and I'm really sorry. I'm not having a go at you. I have to say it. Every single party has to support the folk that's out there. And what they're doing to people, honestly, I'd be the first to go out and fight for MD work. But putting folk on work fear is absolutely ridiculous. It's not working, and I'll be sitting outside every organisation that's promoting the work programme. And I'm pleased to say that Boycott Workfare have just occupied Esther McVeigh's office, and we all have to do it more often.
Thank you, Susan, very much. Okay, We're just going to press pause on the questions. I know there are lots more you'd still like to ask. We will come back to you, but I want to give our politicians a chance to respond. So why don't we do this in reverse order from last time? Drew was asked a couple of questions specifically, and give Drew the first chance to respond. Please don't feel we don't have time to respond to everything, but across the panel we'll cover all the questions as well. Drew.
Yeah. I'll try and be as quick as I can, Jim, and let folk in. On the point about stigma, first of all, I absolutely, completely agree with you. And just in case you haven't seen it, I'll just briefly point you to The Lies We Tell Ourselves, which is a report from some of the UK churches led by the Methodists and a whole range of other people. It is well worth reading, which goes through in some detail some of the myths around the benefit system, because I think actually, you know, the way we win the argument on welfare is, you know, we need to not just talk to ourselves. You know, we know that there are people in this room and that care about these issues, but you know, one of the saddest things I ever find when you talk to folk about the welfare system and say is, why is this affecting me when there's loads of other people they should be going after? We need to break that down. And I think that document from the churches really helps us do that, because there's an argument to be won by people living in poverty about actually the circumstances of why they are there, and particularly around the welfare system. And then there is a wider argument that we need to win with the public. So stigma is absolutely key to that. I agree with you entirely. On the question about fuel poverty, thank you very much for the question. I actually wasn't aware of the campaign in Clydebank, so I'm more than happy to find out a bit more about it. You know, it certainly sounds like it's worth looking at. I'm not going to commit to saying that, you know, the next Labour government at UK level, the next Scottish Executive, Labour Scottish Government would extend eligibility as widely as that. But what I would say is, I mean, I know that last year, for example, here in Glasgow, the City Council actually provided a fuel payment that was over and above the fuel payment that comes from government. So there was an additional payment that came out using City Council money, which went to older people in the city. So I think, yes, there is absolutely opportunities to do more around this. What I would take from that would be, I'm more than happy to go back to the council and say, well, actually, you know, that was obviously focused on older people, it was focused on over 80s. You know, are there other groups here that we could look at, rather than saying, given, you know, this is difficult of how we get into, you know, is the fuel poverty issue and the fuel payment issue only about older people? I would want to be able to do something additional if we can, but let's have a look at it and say, where would we fix the eligibility for that? Because that would be the key thing. I think one of the reasons the City Council was able to do that was because it was quite an easy hook to hang a payment on, and people were able to, you know, make themselves known to the council, and the money immediately followed. So the administration costs of that were tiny. I'd want to make sure that we were looking at hanging a new payment on something, that we were able to use as much of the money that we put into the budget actually went into people's pockets and didn't all go on a new administration system. But it's well worth looking at. The only other thing, though, I would say about fuel poverty is, let's not get completely hung up on, you know, just providing an extra dollop of money from, you know, whether it's the council, the Scottish Government, or the UK Government. There are big issues in the energy market which need to be looked at as well. So, you know, putting more money in at this side in order to give, you know, bigger profits for the energy companies isn't the answer either. So there is work that's going on around collective purchasing. I know, you know, certainly the Labour Party at local level have been involved in some of the Switch Together schemes, where you try and sign up as many people as possible to get them the best possible deal. That is not a solution to all of it, because it's you know, there's still a market problem behind that. So, you know, thinking back to one of the very first things we did when we went into government back in '97 was looking at the utility levy that was introduced on the energy companies. I think we do need to look at taxation in the energy market. We need to look at regulation in the energy market. You're absolutely right in your points about Scotland. We are a hugely energy rich you know, country. You know, we don't want to, you know, at the moment we're kind of having a debate about the volatility of the price of oil, you know, which gets us into a debate of everyone wants to see the price of a barrel of oil go up because somehow that'll be better for Scotland. Well, it won't necessarily be better for you if you're trying to pay your energy bills. So yes, let's look at where we can provide more money to support people in need, but also let's look at the real root of the problem, which is addressing some of the big profits that go on in that industry.
Now, briefly, I just wanted to reflect on what you're describing. A less ambitious version of it has been done in Northern Ireland. A smaller one-off winter fuel payment to some of the groups you're talking about, low-income families below the age of 60. Now, that's because Northern Ireland has a little bit more devolution than Scotland has. We might come back to whether even that degree of devolution should be pushed for even before the referendum, but let me not interfere with the panelists' responses. Let me come to Patrick next.
I want to pick up, first of all, on the term food share. I'm interested to find out more about that, and I've already got Danny's email address from a previous conversation, so hopefully I'll find out a bit more about that. But the idea that food is something where collective solutions should be a normal and an ordinary part of our response to what's happening in food. That shouldn't be seen as a crisis response. It's part of what we have to recognise with food poverty and with fuel poverty, I think, is that these are both systems in crisis, even before we think about the economic crisis, and even before we think about how deep poverty is and inequality are in our country. You know, we've got a food system that's in crisis because of the immense corporate control of a tiny number of vast multinational companies who've taken control of the food chain. And, you know, with the result that, you know, we've seen the meat crisis in the last few months across the whole of Europe, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. And the skills that are being lost in our food system, and I hope that Food Share is also talking about sharing those skills as well as sharing the food. But in an energy situation where we need to talk you're right about talking about people's incomes and trying to make sure people have got the money they need to pay the bills, but we need to think about using less of it. A huge amount of the energy we're all paying for, whether we're rich or poor, is going out the windows and through the walls and the roofs and out the doors. We've got a hugely inefficient housing stock, and we could be saving something like a third of the money we're paying on our energy bills if we addressed that. I want to talk about stigma and attitudes briefly as well, because there was a very good question about that. I don't want to say that it's this simple, but this is one important part of the response that we need to have to this, which is about the media debate at the moment. And politicians are failing to unite on how to deal with media regulation. The media are one of the key sources of a relentless wave of propaganda, not against poverty, but against poor people. And I think that we need to recognise that, yes, we want a free press, but we want it to behave responsibly with the freedom that we all want it to enjoy. And how we deal with that, partly, again, it's about ownership and control of the media, but I think that this issue about how people are represented and misrepresented, you don't have to be named in a misrepresentative article in the newspaper in order to have your life materially affected by it. And I think we need to think about how groups of people, classes of people, and third parties can challenge that kind of misrepresentation and stigma that is deliberately being put into our media. I know that's only one part of the answer, but I think it's an important one.
Thank you.
Bob.
Thanks very much, Jim. You mentioned a couple of the questions raised briefly, because I don't want to ignore any of them. First, like Danny, in relation to food banks, what chimes with me is you want to make sure food banks are not institutionalised within the country as a way of meeting need. You know, society should meet need, not charity to meet need. And I'm very interested in finding out more about what you're doing in Clydebank, so please do contact me in relation to that. In relation to the question on stigma and challenging attitudes, you did actually say, what do you do individually to try and challenge that? I think as politicians, a good dose of honesty is needed. So whether it's white van man, or if you're in a taxi and the taxi driver starts having a go about trying to put the world to rights, if they say something you're uncomfortable with, on an individual basis, you have to confront it. Whether that's, if they talk about, but they're scroungers anyway, confront it. Tell them they're talking nonsense. On an individual, personal basis, you have to confront stigma and that kind of irresponsible talk. I totally agree with what Patrick said about the media and the newspapers, and I want to come back to that later, but on an individual basis, don't take the easy option. You have to confront it directly on an individual basis, whether you're doing your day job as a politician or you're just out at night with your wife or whatever. On an individual basis, you have to be consistent in relation to that. In terms of the cold weather payments idea, interested to know more about it. I thought Jim raised an interesting point about the kind of slightly more powers in relation to devolution in Northern Ireland, but I think that's still only a snapshot of what we could really do. But what I would like to do is comment on something I think Drew said in relation to that, which he said in terms of the widening of provision, he said that he couldn't commit for Labour just now. as to what that would look like after the next election. And I'm going to come back to that in a second because it links in quite nicely to what I think that the nub of it, what Frank said in relation to cross-party support in terms of tackling welfare reform. And Labour in England, but they're still part of it, so have got a poor track record in this. They didn't object to workfare. They didn't object to the benefit up ratings bill that affected the real lives of people in Scotland and right across the UK. They also have now said they will make the bedroom tax workable. They've pledged not to scrap it, but to try and make it more workable. I find that unacceptable. But what I really find unacceptable is the fact that all us politicians around this table talk about softening the blow of UK welfare reform. We should really be in a position where we stop them attacking the most vulnerable in our society in the first place. And we don't have those powers, and we need those powers. So I know there's cross-party consensus, because Frank did talk about cross-party consensus in this room and at this table, including our Labour politicians, in relation to these things. But when you've got a UK Labour Party pandering to the stigma and demonisation of people on benefits and the poor, and the Scottish Labour Party being part of that machine, then it drives the entire Labour Party to the right. And the Scottish Labour Party, despite their kind words, have no power to stop this. Indeed, they won't stop it. The only way to stop it will be the Scottish Parliament having full control over welfare and tax and benefits, because it's not good enough for Scottish politicians to pass the buck and say the big boys and girls in London did that and we don't have power. That's not acceptable in this day and age.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, your response is a good opportunity for Anne to respond to and give a view from the opposition at Westminster.
Right. First of all, I'm quite disappointed that we have gone into an independence referendum debate as opposed to what I thought was the clear focus of today's event, which is what we could do now as activists, as politicians, working together. But let me challenge just a couple of things that Bob has said so that we have the truth as opposed to what Bob might want to have been the situation. First of all, Labour did not support the Benefits Uprating Bill. We voted against the Benefits Uprating Bill, and indeed not just in the Commons, but we challenged it in the Lords where it has to go through. Secondly, on the bedroom tax, we have been challenging the bedroom tax since the moment it was identified in the Welfare Reform Bill. Nothing that is happening in 2 weeks' time is unknown to the government. At every point we told them exactly what we could do. And indeed, only a couple of weeks ago, we supported in the House of Commons an SNP motion to bin the bedroom tax immediately. So let's not try and shade the argument here just to make a point about what might or might not happen in 2015. So on the bedroom tax, we were very clear from the beginning, and we were clear again in supporting an SNP motion in the House of Commons 2 weeks ago what we wanted done with it. And on the Benefits Uprating Bill, we certainly did not vote for it, in spite of what Bob has indicated. But let me deal with the... Sorry?
I said you didn't oppose it.
Excuse me, you need to look at the voting record, Bob.
I will.
We did oppose it. Well, I'm telling you, we did oppose it. And Sue Archibald, who follows all of these things with great keenness, is nodding her head back there. We did oppose it. So I think you just need to look at what you're saying and don't try and misinterpret for your own agenda. But let me deal with Susan's point, because I appreciate that was a difficult decision for everybody last week. It was a difficult decision for us about the sanctions issue, the emergency legislation, and it was a difficult decision for people to understand. First of all, the bill was not about workfare. The bill wasn't about forced workfare. No, and I know you didn't mean to say that, Susan, but that was the sort of interpretation that was put on it. It was about the sanctions regime. Now, Jim, we can have a whole debate about sanctions in the welfare system, but the reality is, as you know, sanctions have been in the welfare system since 1911. Every government Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, or Liberal as they would have been in 1911 through to the late 1920s, always had an element of sanctions within the regime. And that's what the bill was about. Now, we had a decision to make last week whether or not we said that we wouldn't give the government an abstention vote on it so that they could get their legislation through, or whether we opposed it. If we opposed it, two things would have happened, or three things. One, we wouldn't have got the concessions that we did get out of them, which was a full-scale review of the sanctions regime and how it is operating now. And the reality is, in spite of what the DWP ministers have said on more than one occasion, it is operating with a league table. And if anybody has followed the news over the last couple of days, they will see that DWP managers have got a league table of how many sanctions. Now, that needs to be exposed, and that's what we wanted to use this bill to do. And the second thing that we thought was important was to safeguard the rights of appeal of those people who had been sanctioned under the regulations which were badly written. So that was our judgment that we had to make, and I appreciate that people found it a difficult point to accept. But I'm saying to you, we did it in good faith. We did it not against any policy that any government, that any party have ever had before, which is against sanctions. We have always had a sanctions regime. And two, to extract from the government concessions on what is happening out there in the field. It is astonishing that 230,000 people have been sanctioned. We don't know how many of those have been sanctioned for 13 weeks, 26 weeks or 3 years, and we're trying to get the government to come clean on it. So, Susan, I know it was difficult for us as well, but we had a judgment to make. But I want to turn to one or two other issues. John, about the attitude issue, that is an astonishingly important part of our discussions. We are sitting here where a government, since the day and hour that it came into power, created a scenario which victimised, stigmatised, demonised people who were on benefits, people who were poor, people who were disabled. And they had the red tops, and sometimes not just the so-called tabloid press, running with them on that. And we have all seen the stories. And I can say to you, it was almost impossible for anybody to get an alternative point of view into the Mail, the Sun and the Express about what the government were doing. And I personally have challenged government ministers, including Ian Duncan Smith, and the Minister for Disabled People, because I really do feel strongly about the way disability has been demonised in the media, about the way they have manipulated, cynically manipulated the media so that they would build up a public support for some of the really quite cruel issues that they are putting forward. And Jim, I can see you looking at me very carefully here, so I will be quick. I just wanted to spend a bit of time on those two issues. Danny, on the food banks, I like the change of word. I think that is actually a very good way of phrasing it. That is about food sharing, but please, I think we need to be careful that we don't call into question the integrity of those good organisations that are establishing food banks. The Trussell Trust have done tremendous things over the last few months, responding to not a demand, a need out there. And they actually have been very robust in their challenges to government, who have attempted to somehow mix this up with the big society. The big society existed before David Cameron and will exist after he's dead and gone. And the Trussell Trust have been providing that sort of buffer for people for many years. They have responded to a crisis, and I hope that the food share idea, which I think is a nice terminology and something that is very value-based in terms of what it should be about, is an interesting concept. But please let us remember that there are 300,000 people, 300,000 families every week now, as I understand from the Trussell Trust figures, that are actually getting support through food banks, food share and other food banks across the country.
Thank you. I'm just going to... Thank you, Anne. Just want to check with our politicians if they're okay to stay on for another 10, 15 minutes tops. Please tell us your name when the microphone comes. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Neil Farden and I'm from Renfrewshire. Why should we listen to the English government? If we listen to the English government should be listening to us. I'm not talking about the rich to the richest. I'm talking from the poorest downwards. Because that's what the English government are doing. They're turning their ears away from the people that matter. And by the time Scotland gets independence, I would like to see England being wiped off the face of the earth.
Okay, thank you, Neil. We should say, in the interests of political balance, as you will have observed, we don't have any politicians from the coalition parties in the London government, the UK government.
Has there ever been a Tory at the Poverty Assembly, by the way?
We did have a councillor, or a council candidate last year, Patrick, but the point I was going to make is, in response to Neil, is we shouldn't forget that there are 11 or 12 Scottish MPs who back the coalition government, so we should just be careful about how we frame that particular question, especially as they haven't shown up to defend themselves. Anyway, Bill, please.
Bill Scott from Inclusion Scotland. I think the issue that we're talking about dividing people into sheep and goats is nicely illustrated. I wrote to local Labour MP last week after the benefit sanctions debate in Parliament and asked how Labour could justify doing it. And by the way, I accept everybody in that panel as a friend of disabled people, and I'm not getting into party political stuff. But part of the justification that was provided was that Labour had felt that the taxpayers should not pay £130 million back to people who had been penalised, because that would be at the cost of the taxpayer. And that dividing people into sheep and goats is part of the problem, because all of those people who are penalised, 3 out of 4 of them would have worked for 3 out of the last 4 years. They were taxpayers. So in penalising or refusing to penalise the taxpayer, you were deciding to penalise them, and penalise them illegally, because that's what the Court of Appeal had decided, that they had been punished illegally under the previous rules. And I would like to get back to a day when politicians stood up for those at the bottom of the heap rather than stand up for those in the middle. Because it's those at the bottom that need the most standing up done for them, because they are without a voice in so many important decision-making areas, that they need your assistance to talk up for them and give out the message that they are the very people, when your hard-working families are being mentioned, they are the hard-working families. Those people on benefits. And the other thing is about the bedroom tax. 80% of the households that are affected by the bedroom tax contain a disabled person. There is no way of making the bedroom tax fair. It is completely unfair. 8% of the working age population are disabled people. 80% of those affected by the bedroom tax in Scotland are disabled people. It needs scrapped. And you need to give a commitment to doing something in the here and now. Every local authority in Scotland should give the same commitment that Alex Salmon gave at the weekend for SNP authorities. No evictions over the bedroom tax. It is completely ridiculous that anybody should be evicted for that tax.
Okay, folks, Fiona, there's a lady here, and then there's a woman in red right at the back. Thank you. And we can take both of you if you're very brief.
Right, okay, I'll try and talk quickly. Being in this room reminds me, I think I was last here 40 years ago and it had long tables and helpful wee librarians who scurried round the back getting your books for you. But it also reminded me of another thing that happened 40 years ago when I was out kind of, perhaps strangely in view of my current position, campaigning for us withdrawing from the European Union. And I remember one of the things that we talked about at the time was if unemployment rose to over 1 million, that we would have people out in the streets. Well, 40 years later, it's more than double that, and you know, sadly, I haven't seen the sign of the change in attitudes and aspirations that have made that happen. But I think one thing that has changed is how we have viewed the welfare system. And I think that, you know, notwithstanding all that's been said about, you know, the current pernicious welfare reforms that are going on, I think we've got to remember that some of the changes about welfare reform and some of the rhetoric about welfare reform actually happened long before this coalition government. And we were talking about the difference between the honest working people and the feckless shirkers long before this government came into power a couple of years ago. And I think what's important to remember about that, and I make no apology for plagiarising Professor Paul Spicker from Robert Gordon University, who spoke to an assembly of our members last week, the number of people who are continuously been claiming job seekers allowance for 10 years in Scotland is 1,050 people. So this idea that these folk who were unemployed when I was sitting in this room 40 years ago have bred generations of continued unemployed people is nonsense. So I think one of the things we've got to be very clear is that we are not talking about people who persistently, you know, refuse to take work and continue to live on benefits. We're talking about a huge number of people who drift in and out of insecure, low-paid, short-term work, and that is the real issue. And I think I absolutely agree with Patrick about the Scandinavian-style taxes. But the Scandinavian-style taxes apply to most of the population, not the bankers or the 1 or 2%. So I think we all have to be stand up and be counted and be prepared to do our bit.
Thank you.
So we don't have the sheep and the goats. Sorry, one more quick thing. There's a strong correlation, there's a complete correlation between countries that spend most on public service and have most people employed in the public sector and those who have lower child poverty. So I think, as well as looking at the welfare system, we've got to look at what is happening with the cuts to our public services and the kind of multiplier effect of that. Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry, that wasn't really a question, but.
Good afternoon. I'm Eileen Colley from the Scottish Pensioners Forum in Glasgow. Just to confirm something, in 1998, the winter fuel payment was put in so as it was established that it would be cheaper to do so than give pensioners an increase. So basically it was an increase in their pension that year, so it shouldn't really be taken away, and we'll do everything in our power to actually fight for that, because it was an increase. It was to stop, it was instead of an increase in the state pension, and it wasn't a benefit as such. And as Nell had said, you know, the government are looking at taking that away, but we will fight tooth and nail to make sure that's not so. We went to speak to the SSE in Perth in November, and we looked at, as Drew says, you know, community collective sharing and things. They didn't want to know. They says that the domestic consumers, they didn't make their money from that. They walked out, we walked out and, you know, basically were told, no, there's nothing that can be done. The following day, they made an announcement of 397.5 million in profits. You know, people are having to decide whether to heat their houses or eat, and it should be the same across the board for everyone. People shouldn't have to make that choice. It should be the standard that they can heat their homes, they can eat, and that poverty is just too real now. It's a sad fact of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Without responding to each of the points individually, let me try and just sum up a couple of questions that I think our politicians could respond to in summing up. So let me come to this side of the table first. Both Patrick and Bob, with different perspectives, are in favour of independence for Scotland. And Anne's right, tomorrow is the session where we look at independence, but I do want to pose the question about standing in the future and whether this point about that Patrick raised about it's going to take higher taxes, like it or not. You can decide which taxes they are, but if you want to make progress towards social justice, it's going to cost all of us, particularly people who are better off. There are differences amongst people who support independence about where we might go, but Bob, first of all, I mean, would you support higher taxes? Would you support tougher regulation on the energy companies to make sure we're not in this position in the future?
I think we have to move to a period where taxation will be more progressive and more taxes paid by society at large. I note that the First Minister said at the SNP conference at the weekend that he'd asked his Council of Economic Advisors to look to see how we get from where we are in terms of childcare provision currently just now to that kind of best in Europe standard that we'd all like to see. And that will pose some quite tough questions. We'll have to see what comes out of that. So those difficult questions are starting to be asked and how we get there, and I think that's a reasonable thing to say. I'd like to just kind of briefly give Anna an apology. I checked my notes. Labour did indeed vote against the Benefits Upgrading Bill, so sorry for that. And it was the workfare legislation that you refused to oppose, and your UK spokesperson said that you will keep the bedroom tax and that you can fix it, despite the fact that 90% of MPs in the UK Parliament, including Scottish Labour MPs, voted against it. So if you're a Scottish MP, 90% were against the bedroom tax. But I just want to put that on the record, my apology to Anne. But yes, we do need to get towards not just saying we want a better Scandinavian-style society, but actually map out the course of how we get there. But I think that's a challenge for a bit of consensus on this, I hope. Whether or not people believe in an independent Scotland or a more power Scottish Parliament or the status quo, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to map out how we want to take Scotland to that position. So it's incumbent on myself and Patrick to map out how we take Scotland to that position with independence, but it's equally incumbent upon everyone else to map out how they would do it under current powers.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come on to what more we can do within existing powers and budgets just in a moment, but Patrick, you'd said earlier, the challenge is nothing less than remaking the case for this generation for the welfare state. Give us a flavour of what would be different, a couple of the priorities that would be different if there were more powers, either independent or through further devolution, where Scotland was in a position to do something different with some of the issues we're talking about today, like bedroom tax, like welfare reform.
No, I can't tell you why things would be different with one set of powers or another, whether that's independence or not. I will be voting for independence because I fear that if we don't take this opportunity, for example, to build the welfare state that we want to have in this country, there'll be nothing left of it in 5 or 10 years' time. So I'll be voting, but I don't want to divide the room on that. I don't want to divide the room on that. I'm more interested in the things that we have in common, whether you're voting yes or no, whether you're on this side of the platform or that side. I agree with Drew, for example, probably on more of the fundamentals than I agree with Alex Salmond. So we've got a different view on the independence referendum, but I think we need to find the things that we agree on across that debate, because it's not one set of powers or another that's going to let us go in a different direction. It's changing the political landscape. Changing the political landscape will make a profound difference if we do vote for independence, and we can use all of those powers, whether on welfare or taxation or anything else. But if we can change the political landscape during this next year and a half of the independence debate, then even if people vote no, we've got the chance to do something radical with the existing powers. We could be empowering local councils to levy progressive taxation in a way that no Scottish government has been willing to do. We could be decentralising a lot of the control of our economy from big business to local community control and community ownership, whether that's on energy or food or any of the other issues that we've debated. I want us to be able to go further and see full independence. But the most important thing in this debate is the things that we agree on the left of the spectrum, whether we're voting yes or no. Because if we can grab hold of those things, then we'll have the chance of getting political change, whatever the result of the referendum.
Thanks, Patrick. It's a really good challenge, actually, to focus on visions and outcomes, and pathways to get there are a different issue, which we can debate in more detail tomorrow. But Drew, the kind of interesting challenge from Patrick, even if people vote no, first of all, what more should we be doing in the meantime within existing powers and budgets? And then if people do vote no, what does the vision look like from where you're sitting?
Thanks, Jim. So there's a problem in all of this. I can't think of a more negative argument around the Constitution in saying that you should vote yes because otherwise nothing will ever get better. Now, there are huge challenges coming from the current Tory government. I don't agree with them. Most of the people in this room don't agree with them. This panel doesn't agree with them. And we have a different approach to the constitutional issue. And frankly, whatever your approach to the constitutional issue is, and whatever position you arrive at, we're still going to be having these fights after independence or after we vote to stay in the Union. There is no single vote that is going to fix Scotland or fix the world for poor people living here. It ain't going to happen with that one vote. There is something much harder that people in this room and people who care about this issue need to grapple with. Now, when I was answering the other questions, I didn't get into the throwing stuff around as other people in this panel have, and I'm disappointed that they did it. But to the colleague over there who asked about fuel poverty, well, you want to know something you could do about fuel poverty? You could stop slashing the fuel poverty budget, then putting a smaller amount of money back the next year and saying it's an increase. Okay, there are serious things going on that the Scottish Government have powers and responsibility over and are not taking. Right? The poverty in Scotland is not just about the welfare system. The welfare system, the changes that are happening are hugely important, but there are other things that are important about poverty too, about improving people's life chances. That all needs to be part of the debate. Now, to talk about, an English government being a problem here, well, the London government that we had previously lifted 600,000 children across the UK out of poverty. I'm really proud of that. I could debate, Anne and I could go away out of this room tonight and debate everything that we didn't like that the Labour government did, everything that we would have disagreed with about decisions that Labour took in government, and debate away about what we think our priorities should be in the next manifesto. But let us not pretend that progressive change is not possible when we all work together. It is simply not true. Now, we had Kate Pickett through at the Parliament a few weeks ago at a conference on health inequalities, and she'll be known to many of you that care about inequality. Kate Pickett says, when you see inequality in the world, get angry about it and do something about it at every possible level. So within your families, in every part of the world, we do things around gender and the fact that women and girls are subject to inequality, and that happens from the home. That's where that starts. The example I gave you about fuel poverty, that was the City Council here in Glasgow spending money that isn't about a power. The City Council is not responsible for fuel poverty, it is not responsible for regulating the energy market, but it made a political decision, it made a choice. It took budget and resource that it had, and it tried to do something about it. Okay? At every level, Kate Pickett said, and she was right. So there are, to say that there are things that, the problem with Patrick's argument is somehow that if you throw all the cards up in the air and we just hope that they land in a slightly more, that they all land in a progressive setting, 1 to 10, well, they might. They just might, but somehow I doubt it. We need real political, we need to be more serious about this. You need to go away, you need to challenge your politicians, we need people in our communities to be challenging the politicians and the parties on these issues, and we all need to do better on them. Okay? We need to channel the anger that is coming because of these changes and do something about it, not throw it all and say, in 2 years' time we'll get a chance to do something about it, because that bedroom tax that's coming in next April that we've known about when we were debating here last year, Jim. Well, the first time the Scottish Government raised that with Ian Duncan Smith, it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. That parliamentary questions tell us that the first meeting where a Scottish Government minister actually raised that issue with a UK Government minister and actually put the case about what we're going to do about it in Scotland. So let's not just let people off the hook here. At every level, there are decisions and choices to be made, and people need to scrutinise the choices and decisions that are being made on your behalf.
Thank you, Drew. And, well, I'm going to let Anne have the final word and to reflect on maybe some of the issues that we haven't come back to. Nell raised a really interesting point about, should we allow this version of welfare reform to damage the case for other types of welfare reform? Is it about how? Is it about what? Is it about whether? So, welfare reform may be required. It may just not be this kind of welfare reform. So I wonder, Anne, whether you want to pick up on that point or briefly any of the other ones we've heard.
I think Nell made an interesting point which shouldn't be lost, which was that she wasn't against welfare reform as such, but it was actually some of the ways in which it was being delivered and implemented. And I think that is a very important thing to hang on to, because my experience tells me that most people who are involved in frontline activity, who are the recipients of a welfare system, actually want to see reform. And it is the way in which it is done. Now, I see Bill Scott and maybe the women whom I may have shared a long desk with in here some years ago when it used to be the old reading room. Of course, we embarked on a welfare reform programme, but I ask you to think of the atmosphere in which that welfare reform programme was started in 2007 and 8, the support that there was for the most of it, because we took people with us, we took organisations with us. We said that employment and support allowance was not just about employment, but it was about support. We said to Atos, we are not asking you to go for a big bang and implement the work capability assessment. We're doing it as we test it and changing it. And there's been a big difference, a fundamental difference from 2010, when it was all out. The cumulative impact didn't matter a damn to this government. So I think most of us agree that there has to be a progressive approach to welfare reform to make welfare fit for the 21st century. Frankly, the aspirations and ambitions of many of the young people that all of us know are quite different from the days that they were in 1945, 46, 48. And Irene Bevan once said that the National Health Service will be a great success and will not cost too much money, because once everybody's got new false teeth and new glasses, that'll be it. Because that was the aspiration of the time. It was because people got their teeth out and couldn't find another place of getting their teeth put in, or they were going blind because of cataracts. So we're 60 years on for that time, and what I think has been the great strength of the Poverty Alliance is yes, it's been about the future, yes, it's been about the aspiration, but it's also been what we can do at the moment. So for those of you who want to criticise local authorities and politicians for saying we want to mitigate things, I ask you to think through our own history as activists in the community sector. When a government has decided on a policy, we have to look at how we mitigate it. We mitigated it, making sure that when the miners were on strike, we didn't just give them food parcels, we actually gave them money in Strathclyde to look after themselves. We mitigated it through the urban programme. We mitigated some of the worst excesses of the Thatcher government because we used local government creatively. And if there's one challenge I would put out to Bob as the representative of the government party in Scotland, they have powers. They have powers. I would like, Bill, to see an agreement across local government about what to do with the bedroom tax, and the current Scottish Government have the powers to do that. Why aren't they doing it? And this is the challenge we need to throw out. It's not about blaming somebody else. It's about looking at the powers that you have and using them. And in that way, we can genuinely all work together to make things better at the moment, but also to hang on to those aspirations and ambitions that we've got for the future.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm almost certainly out of a job. Peter Kelly's staring at me at the back because we're so over time. I did want to give each of our panellists a chance to reflect on your comments and also some of the bigger challenges that lie ahead of us.